in terms of mopping up of excess liquidity from the system, and then also the intervention, even the Bank of Ghana would prefer that we call it intermediation, by injecting billions of dollars into the economy, cause the strengthening of the local currency. So in terms of our exposure, market to market of external debt, our total debt in CD terms came down significantly. Now the result of all of that is that we had been preparing for an entry into the bond market.
You heard Professor Bokwin speaking on the back of the announcement by the finance minister that, well, it looks like we have the all clear now to return to the bond market. My guests who have been helping us with the discussion this morning: Bright Simmons, Honorary Vice President, Imani Africa; Oliver Bakavomo is Constitutional Rights and Policy Strategy Advisor, Democracy Hub; Dr. Mahamatia Abdul Kabiru is MP Wale Wale and member, Finance Committee of Parliament; Felix Kwachi Ofosu is Minister. Of course, he's also MP, Minister of State, Government Communications. Thank you. Now, Felix, why are we in a hurry? It's like we're waiting to go back to the bond market when in certain quarters there was some praise for the government that in the circumstances that the government found itself, it was doing well, and we're beginning to really now do the true, if you call it, domestication, which is our ticket to our own development.
Yes, but borrowing is a long-standing part of economic management. Every country does that. There's nothing wrong with borrowing. The problem we've had, especially under the MPP, was the extent of borrowing and how mismanagement of the economy made it impossible to pay, which then precipitated all the economic problems we've had. As part of the IMF program, a ban, if you like, for want of a better expression, was put on the ability to borrow domestically for 3 years. That time elapsed sometime last week, and therefore government can return to the domestic market. That is what we have said. It does not mean that there will be a mad rush to the domestic market to borrow left, right, center to imperil the economy. Everything that is done will be done in a manner that is consistent with the level of fiscal discipline we've seen, the level of prudent economic management that we've seen. But that government's borrow, in and of itself, is not a difficulty. It is the extent of it and how you manage your resources. And that is why this government has been prudent in the way that we do our things. When you go and borrow, what is it for, really? Are you borrowing just to meet recurrent expenditure? Or are you borrowing to invest in capital expenditure in the productive sectors of the economy? That will then open up your economy further and ensure that you generate value, generate resources that you are able to use to prosecute your development and finance your budget. This finance minister is particularly strong when it comes to fiscal discipline. The president himself has been in full backing. We've introduced measures like commitment controls. What that simply means is that if you are an agency of government and you bring any request for funding, it will be scrutinized. It will be gone through with a fine comb. It is only those expenditure that we deem essential or necessary that will be approved. Indeed, recently the finance minister has introduced another layer, which will be coming to Parliament very soon for approval, which is the value for money office. It simply means that in addition to what the Public Procurement Authority does, which is to ensure that people comply with public procurement rules, there is an office dedicated to finding out whether the value for purchasing this phone is what it actually is as presented for approval by government. That is intended to reduce the cost of government spending, the cost of government projects, so that whatever resources are available are applied judiciously in the overall interest of the country. So merely announcing that the embargo that was placed on the domestic bond market has been lifted does not mean that there will be a mad rush. Everything that we've done will be sustained. Our objective is to ensure that we don't get back to the problems that we've had in the past, because every analyst of this economy will tell you that the biggest problem we've had cyclically has been overspending. We spend far more than we earn as a country, so we are always in debt. Kabiru raised the issue about COVID. We have challenged it. It is true that COVID had an impact on all global economies. The US, advanced economies were reeling. But at the end of COVID, check the finances, check the economic indices in those countries. you find that even where there were slippages, they were not as wide as ours. What happened in our case? COVID struck globally sometime in 2019. I think in March or so, Ghana recorded this first case. So then we knew that COVID was here. It started. There was a certain government response. There was a lockdown. Some items were shared to vulnerable groups and what have you. But something, by July of that year, we had a handle on COVID and what its impact will be on our resource, on our finances. So the finance minister himself at the time, Ken Ofori-Atta, went to Parliament and said that I had presented a budget for 2020 in November of 2019. However, because of COVID, I need to revise these figures. So he brought a revised budget to Parliament, which was approved, which said that the deficit targets, which essentially means that by how much government was going to spend more than what it brought in, would have to change. They set a target of 5%, I believe, in the budget. Then he revised it to around 10% in July. But by the end of 2020, the election year, it had gone to 15%. The reason was that election year overspending had come to bear on our finances. They saw an election and overspent. Indeed, if you check our comparators, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and what have you, they all face the problems we face with COVID. Indeed, to quote Dr. Bamia, how can a global pandemic jump all these countries and come to Ghana alone? The difference is that we had an election in 2020. And so the government then behaved as governments in the past had done. Anything to ensure that they won elections. So they overspent. They spent money that we didn't have and created a huge finance problem for us. So at the end of 2020, it was clear that we had to go to the IMF. They did it. They wouldn't go. They went around claiming that they were proud people and that they would not go to, and because of the propaganda they had done against the NDC in 2014, 2015, when we went to the IMF. So they waited for far too long. Then sometime in 2022, finally, somebody convinced the president that they had to go. But by that time, it was late. And then they had to do the debt restructuring, which had a horrible effect on bondholders. By that time, our currency had crashed. Inflation was going through the roof. Cost of living was rising. That has been avoided. You find that we set a deficit target of what? Is it 3.6%? We did 3.1%. They made the primary balance the anchor of the IMF program. In other words, if you take the difference between your expenditure and revenue minus debt servicing, which some is obligatory. Sometimes you didn't borrow the money, but you have to pay. So in order to see how well you are managing your resources, they take that out. They set a target of 0.5 plus 0. In other words, they were going to get a surplus. They did 3.9, which means that they had exceeded that target by hundreds of percentage points. We set a target of 1.5 surplus. We have done 2.6%, which is the biggest in recent times. It is a very steep improvement over what we did. So even the targets we set in the budget, we have exceeded it because of prudence. It is not everything that we have spent on. Some have complained that, oh, that means that the monetary or the fiscal policy is too tight. It is necessary to ensure that we don't spend on things that we don't need. So for instance, this independence celebration, we've celebrated it, we did it yesterday. It has not detracted from the fact that we got independence on 6th March 1957. It has not changed our status as an independent country. But we cut down significant waste. We cut down the number of ministers. And something you have been around for some time, so you know what it costs to have a minister in place. Very soon we will send the presidential office staff list to Parliament. I'm sure sometime next week in compliance with the Presidential Transition Act. Something, that list is at least 100 less than what the MPP had. So that is another cut. If you come to the Jubilee presidency today, you will not see televisions blazing with satellite television. It was cut. Indeed, I had to go to beg the president to make a special case for me because I need to monitor global events as part of my mandate. And then he granted it. But every other office has had it shut off. When I came to power, and indeed I said this some time ago when people misinterpreted it. When they give you your appointment letter as a minister or some other public officer, they indicate that you get a certain amount of fuel a week. So initially, we were getting it. The president said, no, I am going to cancel. So he has cancelled it. So since then, I have bought my fuel every week as any other person. And this is widespread across government. That is a significant saving. Yes. You know the cost of a Land Cruiser, something. The ones that, the top of the range ones that public officials use, is about $125,000. So if you have 60 ministers less than your predecessor had, that is savings of $125,000 times 60, running into millions of dollars. That is money that is saved. The salaries of those ministers is saved. They also have to be given a bungalow. And often when they have to refurbish it a bit because it would have deteriorated over the period.
Yeah.
That comes with some money. In addition to the Land Cruiser, they give you a saloon car, which because of what we use should be around $40,000 to $50,000, even if you were to take out duty payments, which is often waived because it is for government. That is another cost, fueling that as well. And the allowances that you get, your travel, the energy cost, utility costs that come in and all that. Even the cost of running the office alone for 60 additional ministers is huge. You understand me? So this government has done everything.
Yeah, so that is
save as much as possible.
That's why there is the expectation that you don't give the impression that immediately we get out of the restrictions from the DDEP, we are hitting the bond market. You went into a campaign where you told all of us about how, the public debt had been at $100 billion US. Nanado took it up to 700.
No, it was 120 billion Ghana cedis in 2016.
Yes.
And it went to around.
Yeah, I meant cedis, yes. Not dollars.
Yes.
And then Nanado took it up to 700, billion. So, and you've come in, you've done all these things to cut costs. Yes. So it looks like you are too much in a hurry. Immediately the restrictions are lifted. You announce that we are going to the bond market.
That is not a problem at all, because when you look at the budget, that's why there's a budget. If you do a budget and you stick to the proposals that you've made in the budget in terms of the estimates, you won't have a problem. The problem we've had is that often we have exceeded that budget. So even borrowing, anytime the finance minister goes to parliament to present the budget, if he intends to borrow within the year, it is indicated clearly in the budget. If you borrow the amount you say you will borrow, or perhaps slightly beyond that, you are unlikely to fall into any difficulty. So borrowing itself is not a problem. It is the extent to which you borrow.
And you are starting with a 10 billion Ghana cedi domestic infrastructure bond to fund roads.
Yes. But you see, those are economic investments. Eventually you recoup it. There are roads that are tolled. So you can have a lag of, say, 10, 15, 20 years, by which, depending on the tenor of the bonds that you've taken, you recoup it. If you borrow and you put it into an economic infrastructure project, you are unlikely to have a problem. But if you borrow only to pay 120 ministers, 361 presidential office staff, political appointees, the civil servants don't contribute anything because they are drawn from other existing public organizations, so they don't add anything to being at the president. But if you have a situation where in 2017 you had 361 staff at the office of the president, you are going to have a difficulty. If you have a government machinery that is larger than is required, you are going to have that kind of difficulty.
Okay.
But the fact that you borrow it cannot be a problem.
Kabiru, let's hear you. And it's good news hearing from Felix, because some of us have been keenly waiting to see the presidential staff list, to see if they have done more than they promised, or they have kept the number.
So you should see it in the next year.
So first and foremost, Felix makes this story out of savings, and he directs our attention to certain areas where cost has been cut. But it is also on record that this government has spent more money than any other government in a fiscal year. That's also a fact. Now, to what end does your cost reduction measures when it does not reduce your budget spending? So it basically meaning that you are either starving some areas and putting into other areas that are probably also not relevant. Reasons for borrowing. Every government, no one has ever borrowed to go and pay staff. Every government justifies the reason why they have to borrow by anchoring on the fact that we need to put it on productive sector, improving our infrastructure base, the basis of which the economy can grow. That's always been the reason. So to create a sense that you are okay, it is okay for you to borrow, but this time because you are going to borrow and put it in infrastructure, it's always been the mantra, it's always been the slogan, it's always been the reason for every government deciding to borrow. Now, when you came to office, even before you came to office, in Parliament, outside of Parliament, you made so much mockery of the fact that the government had to borrow. And you also feel some of the fact that government borrowed to do a lot of infrastructure activity, and that some of which are actually going to yield benefit for this government. We've seen massive and huge monumental infrastructure development under the MPP government across the country, that every single region had their fair share. And when you follow the development tracker or project tracker, we gave you statistics of every district where development projects were going on. And for the first time, we were able to do this with borrowing, among other internal resources. So to create a sense that, and even when you give opportunity to tell us why you are in a hurry to go back to borrow, you go back to history and tell the MPP and everything you get back. Now look, this government clearly by the statement is telling us that one thing, that they are now ready to go back to the bond market. That's the first story they are telling us. Two, they are telling us that they have been too much dependent on the short-term end of the market, i.e. treasury bills, and that they are going to move away from the treasury bills. Three, they are not even shy about it, and they are not even going to do it with some finance. They are telling the whole world that we are coming to borrow. This is clearly a departure from a government that seeks to say that, look, we want to contain expenditure, we want to live within our means. If you decide to borrow, you are basically telling us that you don't want to live within your means. That's the first message you are telling out. And that the moment you create and you signal to the market that I want to borrow, you are telling us that you are trying not to live within your means because domestic revenue that you are generating is not able to suffice for the projects that you want to do and for the commitment that you've engaged to. Now, let's posit this particular decision of government in a hurry to go into the market. There is a delusional fiscal space that this government is seeing. They are imagining some fiscal space. When they look at 45% to GDP of debt to GDP, they see that there is some, maybe if you look at the 60% mark to GDP, there's some, some 25 percentage points around, which some 15 to 25 percentage, 15 percentage point which they can do. But let me explain why I think it's delusional. One of the reasons why I think that it is a fictitious fiscal space is because, one, you have overvalued your currency. And Bright alluded to that fact, that once your currency is overvalued, because you have supported it, you have injected some 20 billion. In fact, every month you support the cedi by 1 billion Ghana cedi, $1 billion injected into the economy to support the cedi. You are basically creating a false strength of the cedi. And that will translate into your debt to GDP being lower than it was before the actual strength of the cedi. So that is one sense of the fictitious fiscal space that they are thinking that they can fit in and borrow more. The second thing is that they lament and borrow, even in this particular platform today. Felix has made nonsense of the fact that there was the debt exchange program. And the government is blamed for the debt exchange program. But they are eating the fruit of the debt exchange program. And you see, the fruits of the debt exchange program, because it created fiscal space, our debt obligations were put into the future. For the whole of 2025, 2026, they are not paying any loan. Those are the fruits of the debt exchange program. So if you sit down and you look at the fruits of that particular program, a painful decision that the Ghanaian people had to swallow in the betterment of the whole country, which the government came into office and they are taking the benefits of it. But you turn around and you are blaming, even under their regime, they have done some debt exchange programs. They didn't say it was bad. We approved it as part of the finance committee. They didn't say it was bad under the previous government, so we were stopping it. They did debt exchange program as part of the bilateral and commercial agreement, as part of the general debt exchange program. So you, on one breath, you are taking an initiative that the previous government took.
You mean you left an obligation that they were fulfilling, and
a government had obligation to deny the program, to repudiate the program, to say that we are not committed to that program. No one tied the hands of the government to it. So you cannot turn and blame the government because you believe, if you did not believe it was a good program, you have terminated it. If the NDC government did not believe that the whole idea of debt exchange was a good program, they would have terminated it. So if someone is talking through the issues and through his mouth is trying to blame a government for a very program that they are taking the benefits of it. In any case, I said it is delusional and it is a fictitious.
I've not seen a Ghanaian who has applauded the DDEP,
I said,
including yourself.
It is that's what I'm saying. Let me tell you from the individual point of view, from the hardship it exposed, every austerity measure, no one will ever support it. Structural adjustment program in the 80s, in the 90s, who applauded it? Everyone under the PNDC, under the NDC, everyone was against it. But it was a necessary and a bitter pill that ensured that our economy recovered. So you will not see people praising it. All right, so that is one delusion that they are creating, that there's some fiscal space, and that fiscal space is created by the debt exchange program, and they want to plug in that particular space by borrowing. Now, they are saying that market conditions are good. And because those market conditions are good, it's okay to borrow now. And they are just trying to fit into the euphoria, into the seemingly good macroeconomic. In any case, those indicators you are priding yourself now, they did not start in 2025. They have become better in 2025, but it is not the case that the trend that you are seeing started in 2025. That's the first fact we have to register. Second, there was an IMF supporter program. Under the program, there were certain decisions that the previous government had to take on the basis of which we will get the significant macroeconomic indicators. Why do you lose sight of that particular decision to even go to the IMF program that impose conditionalities on us, that ensure that government live within its means, that ensure that government should not borrow, either from the domestic or from the external market for 3 years? And that 3 years is coming to an end, or that particular moratorium is coming to an end this week or last week, and then you are issuing a statement to that effect. Because the reason why the IMF put in that conditionality was to the fact that when you have your debt in unsustainable levels, and then you are borrowing, and when I'm giving you money, you may have a tendency to use the money to pay your debtors. It's quite tempting. So because of that, we have to put in that particular condition to say that, look, from now on until such time that we are out of the program, no servicing of your debt obligation, and you should not borrow. There was even a cap of 250 million per annum in terms of the net addition into your debt.
May I ask you one question?
You may.
You don't see anything positive about anything that has happened so far?
No. I see.
What's your?
Let me give
any prescriptions for the government?
I have prescriptions for government, and I think that
the restrictions on the DDEP are we are getting out of it, and so they should go borrow.
So let me. I was coming to the prescription. In any case, I'll be the least to say that things are not better than they were in 2024. I've always stated it. I've never shied away from it, and it is infidelity to the fact that I make those concessions. They on the other side, in fact, they try to even say that you did nothing. When the facts shows that things were put in place, certain measures were taken that culminated into the results we are seeing. So I'm the least to take away any shame from this government by not acknowledging.
Returning to the bond market is bad. Is that what you're saying?
No. I'll tell you why it is.
Because your regime ran the economy literally on the bond market.
Let me tell you why it's a dangerous thing. We ran it on the bond market, and the difficulty and the risk that we didn't contemplate was that there was going to be a crash of the economy. Because when your economy is expanding, you are borrowing, you are thinking that debt to GDP will always save you. That's the thinking of every policymaker. That when you did not contemplate a disaster, that will strike and even make sure that you have zero growth, or negative growth. No one had contemplated, and this government is making the same mistake. And that's why we are drawing their attention to that possible trap, that debt trap that we found ourselves cyclical in. They are falling into that. The reason why they are doing this is that, one, revenue is not performing. If your revenue is not performing, and you are rushing to borrow, you are basically going to increase yourself or throw yourself more into the debt trap. Because government itself, their revenue target for 2025, they fail to meet that. So when you fail to meet your revenue target and you are in a hurry to borrow, that is one risk that you are going to face. Two, the structure of the economy and the changes we are seeing, the positive changes we are seeing, are not based on structural changes. They are based on, if you like, administering the symptoms, trying to address the underlying symptoms of the economy. They have not addressed what can culminate into what we call the real sector improvement in a manner that the structure of the economy will change so that it can support any borrowing you want to do. What I see and what I anticipate is that this government will continue. They will borrow long term to fulfill their current obligation. Okay. And that cycle is going to go. So for me, I think that government will have to hasten slowly. I'm not of the least saying that government should not borrow.
Okay.
I have to make that point clear. I'm supporting the fact that government would have to finance its development activity. The use of that particular borrowing must be geared towards, like you said, productive sector, supporting infrastructure. Right. However, the tendency for you to lose sight of the fact that you think that gold prices are increasing, imagine for a moment gold prices should reduce.
Thank you.
What happens here?
I see Felix is itching to say something, but let me go around and return to you. You're still here on Newsfile. This is your most authoritative news analysis platform. And here on Newsfile, we put Ghana first. And someone is pointing me to a part of the president's speech where he said that over the past year, We have taken decisive steps to stabilize our economy, restore investor confidence, and rebuild fiscal discipline in how we manage our resources. Inflation is declining, the local currency is stabilizing, and confidence in the Ghanaian economy is gradually returning. We have renegotiated our debts to obtain more sustainable terms for our people, and we have redirected valuable national resources towards healthcare, education, agriculture, and employment creation. So this sort of supports Dr. Kabiru when he talks about the benefits derived from the restrictions that were imposed by us through the DDEP program. Bright.
The IMF program.
Yes. The IMF program, which is yes, of it. Correct. Yeah. I remember how we got a junk status of ratings for our economy and everything else.
So, I mean, let's not, clear about the bush. The domestic environment has become extremely benign. Inflation has moved from 54% to 3.3%. Government borrowing costs annual on the short end of the market is now below 10%. Mm-hmm. This is, nobody can fight with the data. It's completely unambiguous. So that's one point to make. And therefore, it's not surprising that the government, seeing those kinds of macroeconomic indicators, will begin to think about borrowing a little more. The issue that we face is that there is a tension between the fact that the government must indeed go back to borrowing long term, because right now it borrows short term, it borrows for up to a year. That's why the Treasury bill is 91 days, 181 days, 365 days, or 364 days. So in essence, the government is nobody trusts the government enough to give it money for more than a year. That's what we've experienced the last 3 years. Every government should have an inclination to want to move out of that situation. You want to borrow for a longer period because it gives you more flexibility. It gives you more room to lock in favorable interest rates for longer. Because if you imagine that the government issued at 13.5%, which is the indicative pricing, 13.5% means that for 10 to 15 years, it's locked to that cost. It doesn't matter what happens in the interim. So that gives you predictability. You can plan, you can make medium-term arrangements because you know what the cost is going to be to you over a 10-year period. So there is a lot of reasons why a government must go back to borrowing for long term. It just makes a lot of sense, right? You have pension funds which are, heavily exposed to what we call duration mismatches. They take money and then they are not supposed to pay back because people work for 30 years of their life, 20 years of their life. Then you have to pay them back. So you also need, on your asset side, so that's your liability side. On your asset side, you also need instruments or assets that will pay for a long period at a predictable rate. So when you build your models, you know that in the next 20 years and next 30, I'll be able to pay all these pensioners as my liabilities come due. So pension funds also need long instruments. Right now, they are relying on what? Not much. Some treasury bills here and there, and then, and the government also tried to block them from investing overseas, even though that was a small piece of the investment pie. So that is also something that's quite critical. The third element is that next year, we fall into a maturity wall. Remember that in 2023, the government literally took about nearly half of all the domestic debt and cut the returns up to almost 10% on some instruments, and then extended average maturity from roughly 4 years to almost 14 years. This was huge. Banks were hit by about 40 billion cedis. So it's not a small thing, right? Now, a lot of that cure had involved postponing when the payments come due. Now, in 2027 and 2028, a lot of that payments come due between 2027 and 2029. In fact, 2027 is the largest single redemption year. So what that means is that, something about $4.something billion is due next year. All of this creates conditions for management that are quite extreme. And that is the positive case for going back to the long-dated instruments. Now, here is the negative case, which the opposition leader in the studio, Dr. Kabiru, is pointing out. And that is this. Your current environment is favorable because on the short term, people think things are likely to be good for the short term. Given the way things have behaved over the last 2 years, particularly last year, there's a lot of confidence that between now and 2027, the country's domestic macroeconomic environment, the way the economy is, will largely be benign, to largely be positive. It's not, most people are not worried too much about 2026 and most of 2027. Now, that does not mean, though, that most people are not worried about the next 10 years. That's a huge contradiction. That's the paradox. The reason being that we have a cyclical history. We have a history where we do very well, consolidate, stabilize, and then we trick investors to come back in, big, and then we do our thing again, which is why we've gone to the IMF 17 times. So you can have a very positive short-term outlook on Ghana. The question is, do you have a positive long-term outlook on Ghana? Do you think in 10 years, over 10 years, things will be generally positive? Because if you don't, then you will happily lend to the government in the short term at less than 10%, but when it comes to the long term, you want 20%. So the government is forced to do an amazing balancing act, where it's trying to convince you that not only are things good now, but somehow it has fundamentally changed the way Ghana is governed, that you can trust Ghana for the next 10 years. And if it's not able to sell this story credibly, then it faces humiliation because it doesn't get its indicative pricing. My sense is that it will get the indicative pricing because the amount is not a lot. 10 billion cedis in the larger scheme of things is not as much as it sounds. So I think there are enough investors who will take the risk, even at 10.5% for a small delta between what they can get on the short end, the 1-year bond and the 10-year bond. But it's a very ambitious gamble because trying to get somebody to move from, in a year, I can lend to you at almost 10%, to get that person to lend to you at 13.5%. It's a for 10 years or something like that. It's a serious push for confidence. So that is where the challenge is. If the government does not get that indicative price and is forced to move it up, then what happens? Then this new pricing, this new longer term pricing becomes a new benchmark for so many other product pricing across the market. So the government is really, really keen on settling on a really low price, around less than 40%, maybe maximum 15%. And the challenge is whether or not the rest of the market feel the same degree of confidence. Not in terms of the short term, not in terms of the next year, but over 10 years. That really is the issue. The second is that the government is testing the waters. If the bond the bond issuance is wildly successful, nobody believes that it will end there. So it's going in with a very simple story. We are going to use this for tolled roads. We are going to use revenues from tolled roads to pay it back. You have nothing to fear. But once this goes through, it will come back and start borrowing again. The problem is, it has not retrenched from the treasury bill market. So you now have a parallel market where it's dumping issuances into the treasury bill market, and at the same time it's trying to move into the long term. Some people will argue that it needs to do some, let me use a simple word, some conversions, attempts to redeem some treasury bills and slow down treasury bills just as it ramps up on long-term debt issuance. So that's going to be very important. We should also remember that we've not completed our restructuring. This is our debt restructuring because the commercial debt holders are not playing ball. And about 6.5% of that is commercial debt holders. So private sector companies that were supposed to also, apart from, of course, energy sector companies. So you saw the energy sector players agree to a haircut of, I think it's 15%, that ASEP and others advised on. But beyond those, when it comes to, some of the commercial banks in Germany and elsewhere, where we borrow money to do things like KJTR and other things, they've really been adamant about not restructuring. We haven't heard much about that so far. China has still not signed a bilateral debt agreement with us. We just recently signed with Belgium. So it means that even in the EU, which is one of the most, proactively favorable towards the restructuring, we've struggled with some countries. All of this means that some investors, some creditors to the state of Ghana, to the Republic of Ghana, are quite cautious. And they are cautious around whether or not they'll be taken for fools. Because, why should we restructure if you're going back to the market to borrow again? And they have been vindicated in this essence, right? Because while you're asking people to restructure because you don't have money, etc., you are going into the market and will potentially issue at a rate that is higher than what you are offering those that you are restructuring with. So these are all very interesting dynamics that are at play. And my sense is that investors look at everything. And then you build your model, and then you start to isolate to the most critical elements. And that is where the government might still win, because ultimately you look at all the factors and you go like, yeah, but Ghana is still one of the anchor economies in the region. The government is still doing relatively well. Gold seems to be on a super cycle, and gold is now a huge, important anchor of the economy. But despite all those favorable trends, we should remember that gold, for instance, is not a permanent cycle. We've seen gold go up and come down very significantly. So some of that external, the benign external environment, some of those elements could change. So there is a hugely complicated issue. All that I would say is that the government definitely has to go back to the market. It's just a matter of how it does it. How does it price the balance between short-term confidence versus long-term credibility? Those are the dynamics. These are
in just a minute or some 30 seconds, help me with some explanation. If the government is looking for money, there is a government that has seen oversubscription of the treasury bills 8 consecutive times. I don't know, but in my basic understanding, that means there's a lot of money chasing the government.
Yes, that's the short term. So essentially, you trust that the government will do well this year, next year. Do you trust that after President Mahama leaves and the next government, will they follow the same austerity principles? Because there are people in this country who think the austerity program has not been sensible, because they feel like the vulnerable have been hit too hard. When you look at VAT returns, for instance, you see that VAT returns have increased, but the underlying consumption expenditure has dropped. So essentially, people are spending less and paying more tax.
Okay.
Some people don't support that. Let's say the environment changes. Second point that is also very important. So whether or not you trust the government 5 years from now or 10 years from now is the issue, not just whether you trust the government now or next year. But the second point is that because we've had 3 years of no data, we don't have actual market reference for pricing. And so it cuts both ways. It means that you actually need to go into the market again to establish reference, so that at the very least you have a sense of your medium-term borrowing.
Thank you very much.
But it also means, therefore, that at this stage, nobody really knows what a 15-year bond in Ghana should be worth, or 15-year lending to the government should be worth.
Thank you, Bright. Yes, and Oliver, so I don't know where how you look at this issue, and I'm coming to you from the perspective that you have sought to be in the trenches with the very poor people. Of course, the MPs here will have that experience as well. But for, a people that were told and sold a story about the public debt that was so much, from, as in 120, as Felix spoke about, billion in 2017, and was taken to 700, billion Ghana cedis by the Akufo-Addo regime. Do you also feel there ought to be some caution in getting into the bond market, because there are a lot of rules that have to be done and so on and so forth, and this is where they are going to get this money for?
Thank you, something. I think that you're absolutely correct. There's a bit of caution that I have in connection with this, but more broadly, I think maybe I would want to constitutionalize the conversation a bit more, because when you look at the Kwesi Prempeh Committee's report, the issue of our debt is something that the committee pays a lot of attention to. Because what they do is that they try to historicize the conversation, and the knowledge that the levels at which we indebt ourselves as a republic is something that has been a big part of the politics and concern of Ghanaians for so long. If you cast your mind back to Achampon's year in Tuya, after Nkrumah's overthrow and the excessive debt that the NLC and others have gotten into before Achampon came in, debt has been a bigger Ghanaian problem for a while. So they look at the 1992 Constitution's framework and say that the framework was intended to do something around how we create or we avoid the recurrent fiscal instability points and weaknesses within our public finance governance regime consistently, and ask ourselves whether or not we've been able to achieve that. In this regard, they make 6 key proposals as to how they propose going forward to deal with the problem. In fact, one of the things that Democracy Hub had presented to the committee was we're asking even for us to go to referendum whenever the government decides to go to IMF again, because the people must be involved, and the mechanism that was set up for Parliament to watch over debt have not been achieved. But this is what the committee was saying. they're making proposals, one about the requirements to treat tax exemptions to recharacterize them as tax expenditures, which must be subject to clear annual ceilings and public reporting mechanisms. And I can get a little bit into each of these six when I've given a summary of them. The second thing that we're talking about is how we deal with internally generated funds and the need, and particularly in terms of earmarked statutory funds as well. The regime that governs is considering that the vast majority of public resources sit outside the government's accounting system and are managed by public institutions without any framework to guide them. The third thing that they take into account is the Controller and Accountant General's department, where they're asking that it now become like a constitutionally recognized fiscal gatekeeper, which will be responsible for approving withdrawals and commitments from public funds. Fourthly, they're saying that there's a need for a medium-term economic framework which will be approved by Parliament even before the annual budget is considered, which would have stronger disclosure obligations around public debts and contingent liabilities. They're also asking for Parliament to review, as a fifth point, how we get into international business transactions under Article 181 of the Constitution. And they did a lot of talking to SKB Asante to go into their thinking as to how we introduce that provision regarding Parliament to approve international business transactions and what history. And if you know SKB Asante himself, who has worked with the Bretton Woods system, recognize this as a developing country problem. And so that was introduced into the 1992 Constitution. And then finally, they're asking for tighter constitutional safeguards around how the Bank of Ghana may provide direct financing to governments. Again, this was something that was a campaign issue, even for the NDC, going into the election around the printing of money more generally. So as we are talking about returning to the debt market, it is important that we think again as to whether or not a lot of these things have been spelled out in a way which ensures, and not only on, and I don't doubt Felix's commitment or the government's commitment to be able to manage the debt problem. The question is that it should not be left to political discretion alone. This is a constitutional, and Ghanaians are interested in it.
Right.
What are the prior commitments we are making to Ghanaians regarding how we are going to do? Let's have that prior conversation first before we jump back into the market. Like we started first for talking about, the pressures that is going to happen from the ongoing war on the money that we're expecting from gold exports. And we know that there's going to be pressure, liquidity pressure. So the government is definitely, before the year, 100% going to go back into the market. There's no doubt about it. Even though Felix says that, it's not said that it's going to do that, it's just saying that we are able to. We know they're going to do it. So the Constitutional Report is saying that, okay, let's take the question of tax exemptions. What has been happening so far is that we have treated these things as isolated concessions and waivers that we are doing without a clear sense as how it ties into the broader fiscal governance architecture of the country. So to avoid this, they are proposing that at the beginning of the year, there's a clear roadmap that is laid out that shows us what is the tax cost as to the proposed tax waivers that the government, or tax exemptions that the government is thinking about. How do we make it more predictable and also ensure that we don't go outside the framework no matter what happens within the fiscal year? Then they're also saying that when you think about Parliament's role in terms of managing the public purse, we have overly focused on the consolidated fund, that we have not gone beyond the consolidated fund to look at the internally generated funds. And so for so many of these institutions, there's so much discretion on how they are going to spend those internally generated funds. They see it as their own institutional petty cash that they can do so much with without the government having any say in them. So the committee is saying that it is important that Parliament passes legislation to say, one, this is the percentage of the internally generated fund that you may use and how much you have to return back into the public purse. Two, when you design your own budget for the year, it needs to be clearer what percentage of that is funded from the internally generated funds. And so that there are no deviations from how you intend to use the funds, and that is not subject to only your discretion as we go along within the fiscal year. Then the question of withdrawals from the public funds in terms of how we are able to pay, one, the statutory earmark funds, which are often delayed. There's no timeline for it. We don't know when it is happening. Government overcommits itself in terms of even its tax loan repayments and things like that. That let the Controller and Accountant Generals move from being a department of the Ministry of Finance to become a constitutional body. So if, for instance, the auditing framework is constitutionalized with an Auditor General, So the chief accountant then also becomes a constitutional body that manages approvals of money that is coming in and going out at every point in time in terms of how they conceptualize the framework.
All right.
Then on the question of where liabilities sit, one of the things which is quite interesting when you look at what's happening with Google Board is that, there's a meeting of cabinet, they decide that, okay, this amount of money that is sits on your books, we are moving into this books, we are moving into that books. That mechanism that has been used in the past to hide, the full extent of our public debt system, that government is then able to borrow, is something that Parliament needs to control better.
Right.
And we have to put in place a mechanism for it. And one of the mechanisms they're thinking about is the medium-term economic framework that is supposed to be aligned with, along with now the statutorily introduced independent fiscal council that is supposed to have a broader role in terms of how we manage this, and it's not only left to political discretion.
Right.
So I've seen, for instance, that CROSAC has come out and arguing against the constitutional elevation of the Controlling Accountant General's Department. And of course, I'm confused as to why. But this is one of the things about constitutional reforms that we commit to, that it's a constitution, it's an architecture. So that when you take a question of our debt, you are redesigning the entire architecture, and all of them have to fit into each other as a single piece to be able to make sense in how we govern our debt and how we govern conversations about our going into the bond market, our going into foreign bond. And I think, Professor Bokpin has also talked about, okay, are foreign investors also allowed into this? Is it only going to be the domestic investors? All these conversations needs to be front-loaded and not after should we be having that conversation.
Interesting. So as you spoke about the recommendations in the Constitution Review, I just went to some of the specific paragraphs about borrowing and public debt, the ceiling and all that is required and what the committee wishes. From where you sit, so I've heard people speak and I can tell that they haven't read a document, they haven't understood what Kwesi Prempeh and his team got to do for this country. And so they are not too sure what ought to be done. And yet you hear some of them speak very categorically. I heard somebody say it did nothing about the public finances. They did nothing about it. And I'm like, oh, really? You haven't read. So maybe you just need to take time to read. Do you think that if these recommendations were implemented quickly, what sort of relief will it bring to the Ghanaian, the poor person?
If you allow me, I'll talk about the first part of the question about people who haven't read. And this is one of the things I was cautioning the committee about releasing the abridged recommendations only. Because so far, still now, the government has failed to release the full report into the public for people to be better informed as to the context of the recommendations which have been made. And I think that I'm hoping that the government can prioritize it at least in this Ghana month or the week of the independence, because there's a real conversation started about how we organize the country. Now, in terms of the host of recommendations...
We don't like to read, though. 600 plus, who is going to read? You know, we always talk about the job that you guys did under Professor Fiajo's commission. 1,000 pages. You have no idea only how many Ghanaians have read it.
No, I completely agree. I mean, even when it's abridged and summarized into 3 pages, you can be sure that even shorter articles of Bryce Simmons' website are not being read. So I don't have any hope. But at least in terms of public intellectuals and folks who are engaged in this conversation, I think that it is unforgivable to join the public conversation without an attempt to sit down and understand the context and the findings that underlie the recommendations that have been made. Now, broadly, one of the things that are crucial about the report that has been made is a concern about the people we are leaving behind. You know, it's funny my use of the word, because they actually have a chapter which says leaving no one behind. Because what they are saying is that we have created a democracy which is concentrated among the elite, and there's an elite consensus that this democracy works for us. But the vast majority of people in this country are completely checked out of it. Because one, it is not producing the economic and fiscal mechanisms that would lead to their well-being. And the 1992 Constitution itself warns against that when it says the most secure democracy is the one that anticipates the needs of the people and provides for them.
It says the basic needs.
The basic necessities. So the committee took this as its creed and said that how do we ensure that government is not so disconnected, that the decisions that are made are so calculated and so constrained in a way that they produce the best outcomes for the people more generally. Now, if most people would be able to sit down and go through this document, I think that they'll be so outraged that nobody will want to hear anything from any politician other than we need constitutional reforms today and we need it urgently and now.
All right.
We need to fix the ground rules in order to better secure the democracy. I have no doubt about the good intentions of our politicians when they sit and talk to us, but history has shown us that consistently, those good intentions do not produce the kind of results that we want them to. It is only by providence that we have a constitution that says that we cannot have a one-party state. If not, our history in the country has shown us that politicians have gone there and told us that that is the only way in which they can better secure life for us. So constitutions work to keep politicians in check.
Right.
I think that is important to prioritize the reform.
Thank you very much, Oliver Bakavomo. And okay, so I think it's time again for me to return to those who pay for the show, and then we will then return a matter that may also, bother on the economy about the mass dismissals that happen, and the minority has been very, very unhappy about those dismissals. Now, a committee was set up, the committee finished its job, and Felix has been updating us on that. But I think, yes, I'd rather take the break and return, because I see you've written a lot you want to respond. Once you do, Kabiru will also say he wants to. But there's something that's happening rather very beautifully without all of you knowing. I don't think you did. All of you did 10 minutes.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't have to struggle to get you to stop on the 10th minute. It's a bit of Bright and Oliver who have taken us to about 11 minutes. We'll be right back.
We just have stayed disciplined.